This segment is brought to you in part by the Canadian Historical Arms Society, owners of the Genesee Range, the premier recreational sport and training facility in Western Canada. See us online at historical-arms.com.
The Quiet Professional, a podcast about law enforcement, security, justice, and politics. We are digging deeper on the issues and going where the information takes us with access to experts and authorities. Welcome to The Quiet Professional. Hey everybody, welcome back to The Quiet Professional. As America approaches its 250th birthday, we're taking the opportunity to explore some of the nation's history and the ways that history has been told. To help with the big discussion today, I'm joined by two others. First is my regular podcasting partner, especially when it comes to American history. It's John Simpson. So John, welcome back.
Good to be back.
And our guest today is Benjamin H. Milligan, who served as a U.S. Navy SEAL from 2001 to 2009, earning the Bronze Star, among other awards. He holds a BA in history and a master's in international relations. Ben is the author of By Water Beneath the Walls, The Rise of the Navy SEALs. And since publishing, he has combined writing with speaking on leadership, organizational change in American history. And since its publication, it has become required reading throughout the U.S. Special Operations and Intelligence communities. So welcome to you, Ben.
Hi, guys. Thanks for having me.
Hey, I'm glad John could get you in here. John's coming through with some special guests. So thank you for joining us and making the time, because I know you're a busy guy. So
yeah, and I really appreciate you coming in, because it's like I was very, very enthusiastic about your book when I read it, because for two main reasons. And you and I have talked before online, where it was like, you start off with a very simple question of how did the U.S. Navy wind up with a bunch of guys that are operating so far from the ocean? And you produced an entire book out of it to tell that story. And then one of the ones that I keep on mentioning is I never in my wildest dreams thought that one of the best histories of the U.S. Army Rangers in World War II would be written by a sailor. So really glad to have you on the show.
Thanks, guys. I'm delighted to be here. I'm honestly surprised anyone's still interested in this. Book came out 5 years ago, so it's been a minute. So yeah, I'm glad to talk about it. I'm glad that people are still interested.
Yeah, definitely. You know what? I gotta say, it is a behemoth of a book. It has everything. It's got more than just the Rangers history. I mean, it's got history from all branches of the military and all across the world. What I'm kind of wondering is, and maybe the best place for us to start is just what drew you to this story, and what did you expect it to be when you started it? Was it gonna just solely be focused on the SEALs, and then it blew up into all this?
I mean, I had an idea for a book pretty early on. It took me a minute to get sort of convinced to even write a history of the SEAL teams. When I'd wanted to write a history book since I was a kid, which is a weird thing to, want to do when you're a kid, but for whatever reason, I'd always wanted to do it. And when I set out to write a history book, my first thought was I was going to write, a history of, Americans in the First World War or some other period that I was really interested in. The last topic that I was, that I wanted to pursue was a history of my own service, or my own, the institution that I came from. It wasn't until, kind of two main events happened that I started to get hooked on the subject. One was the killing of Osama bin Laden, the arch villain in the War on Terror. And the second one happened 3 months later, which was the downing of the Extortion 17 helicopter. Extortion 17, was the largest loss of life for coalition forces in the war in Afghanistan. Now, both of these events, they happened 3 months apart from each other. Both, disproportionately involved Navy SEALs. And both of these events happened more than 600 miles away from the closest saltwater. I thought that was a remarkable thing. And I didn't understand why. Like, how had, SEALs come to, dominate these conflicts, or not dominate, but how had they come to be so involved? That one, SEALs were used in, one of the most important raids in American history, and two, how were, SEALs involved in the largest loss of life? It seemed like a question that no one had ever even attempted to explain. And I thought it was important. I thought it was important for me. I mean, I didn't know. I had every time I had served in a forward operating base or anything like that with Marines or soldiers or anything like that, all of us, NSW guys, or Naval Special Warfare guys, we always got, side looks or weird looks. And I think it's just something that Naval Special Warfare has always been a little bit self-conscious about. We've never really understood how we got there. And so when I set out to do the book, when I set out to kind of structure it out, I was like, if everything's going to, the book has to answer a question. And I think if there's one thing that I did in the writing of the book that was smart, was I structured a question in such a way that would allow me to sort of use, Naval Special Warfare as like the central character in a biography. And every great biography I've ever read about any, character, whether it's John Adams or, Ulysses S. Grant, it uses that central character as sort of a vehicle to tell the stories of all these other people that were influential in their lives. And the SEAL teams, they've never owned battle space. They didn't create themselves. They had all of these other institutions that sort of helped them, come into existence. And I thought, what a great lens, to not just tell the history of the SEAL teams, but to tell the story of all American special operations.
Where does like that? You said early on in your life, you kind of had this inkling that you wanted to tell a story or write a book. So that didn't just start from the time you were in the SEALs and things you had seen. So what kind of drew you to that, or what do you think kind of instilled that idea into your head?
I had great parents. My dad, read to me, from an early age. He read to all of, me and my siblings. So I grew up kind of listening to books. So I've always really liked books. I've always liked I'm probably the world's biggest advocate for Audible, or audiobooks. My mom was a great, encourager of reading and writing. And probably the most influential person in that is my grandfather, my mom's dad, who he himself had been a World War II Marine. And then he had, after Okinawa had secured, and they were, looking for folks to, the underwater demolition teams, they knew that the invasions of Japan were coming up, and they didn't have enough underwater demolition teams or frogmen, to recon the beaches. So the Navy had opened up the ranks of the UDT to the other branches of service, and they took volunteers from the Marine Corps at that point. And my grandfather volunteered. So my grandfather was one of the handful of Marines that were trained to be a UDT frogman on Okinawa. So, but not only was that kind of influential, he's the one that, he got me hooked on history. Growing up, he would read to me, my dad was reading, C.S. Lewis and age appropriate books. My grandfather was reading completely inappropriate, books on like the French and Indian War and scalpings and things like that. And I was, couldn't have been more hooked. I mean, it's the perfect sort of way for a little boy to grow up. And I just knew that, there was something about, the power of books and the power of history. And when I was in junior high, I don't know why, but he he took me on a trip just by myself to the Gettysburg battlefield on a fall break. And then that just made a kind of a tradition of it. Every year or two, we would go on another trip and we would go to another Civil War battlefield. And I just got hooked. Mm-hmm. And so I was always into books. I was always, I was kind of a bit of a bookish kid, a solitary kid. And I just, I don't know, it's just something that I'd always thought, that's got to be the coolest thing that you could ever do. And it was my marathon. Some people, they, for whatever reason, they think that the hardest thing they can do is a marathon, or that, they want to challenge themselves to do it. I've never run a marathon, but this was my marathon.
Well, I think, especially you mentioned it toward the end of the book, and it was a 2-year goal that turned into an 8-year project. So I think it was a little harder than a marathon, in my opinion, because nobody's running a marathon for 2 years, let alone 8 years. But I'm going to come back to that. One of the things you mentioned, though, was you were talking about answering questions. And that was one of the things that I wondered, you go throughout the book and all this research you talk about that you had to do, but did you have any questions that weren't answered or that you couldn't find answers to? And then with that, how long did you stay on those topics? Because there's so much to get to. So it's like, how do you decide, okay, you know what, this isn't important, or I'm not getting anywhere, so I'm just going to have to leave this out?
Every chapter presented its own sort of problem. I kind of knew, I had an idea of where I wanted the book to start. I knew that I wanted the book to start with Macon and the Macon Island Raiders. And I knew that because I knew that the Navy had created the Raiders to be the Navy's raiding force. So I knew that was the first instance where the Navy, the institution of the U.S. Navy had said, we need our own raiding force that we can, send to do these missions, these behind the lines type missions. A force that is completely ours, that we don't have to, get permission to use or anything like that. So I knew I needed to start with the Marine Corps Raiders. After that, though, it was kind of I also knew that I wanted to end in Vietnam. I wanted to get to a point where the SEAL teams became what the SEAL teams are today, kind of a go anywhere, capture, kill force. Or at least that's anyway. So I knew those were sort of my bookends. From there, I knew that I could kind of, range in between them. I just had to, find the connective tissue that connected those two very disconnected events in American history. And I knew that, various institutions have been created along the way, the Scouts and Raiders, the NCDUs, the UDTs, the Army Rangers, the Army Special Forces. And I knew they were sort of all, connected, but I didn't know how. So I just sort of I tried to find, the most important or consequential missions that would tie all of these things together. And then once I found that, that mission or that battle, then I would just try and trace who the most important person was in that, and then I would just do as much research as I could. But you're right, the research was the research was different for every chapter. The first chapter, the Marine Corps Raider chapter, so much has been written on the Raiders that I was almost able to do it without stepping foot into an archive. Most of the after-action reports that were written, even Carlson's after-action reports, those are available online. You just go on a couple of sort of academic websites or Fold 3. Okay. You can find all that stuff on there. So I didn't have to do much. It wasn't until my second chapter on the Scouts and Raiders that I had to leave my home office and start figuring out how these archives worked. And there were moments that I hit complete dead ends. You do all before I would go to an archive, I would do as much sort of online research as I could. I would just kind of go through each of these archives databases, and I'd find which box probably had the stuff I need, which folder had the stuff I needed, and then I would get to the archive and I'd look in the box or I'd look in the folder and nothing would be there, a completely empty folder. And before you lose all hope, you just you kind of start exploring within the box. You look to the folder to the left, look to the folder to the right. Before you know it, you're finding stuff. And that happened every time. So even if I set out to, research something, and I knew that this was going to be the document that was going to prove my thesis for this chapter or something like that, I almost would never find that thing that I was looking for, but I'd find 10 other things that would.
Yeah.
There was one story that I was trying to research the Virginia 1 mission in Korea. That was probably the best example of having a hard time, finding, the research to back up the story that I wanted to tell. The Virginia 1 mission was a mission that happened in 1951. It was first of all, it was a mission that the Navy wanted. There was a hard to reach tunnel that the Navy wanted raiders to destroy. It involved Army Rangers, and it involved Korean guerrillas. So those were the three things that I knew that were going to take me to where I needed to get, to talk about Army Special Forces. So I needed all those three things to line up, and the Virginia 1 mission was the perfect, kind of way to point me or to push me into my next chapter. Problem with the Virginia 1 mission is I couldn't find anything on it. I couldn't find any documents that, or any primary source documents that would actually tell me the real story. I found, lots of books that had been written, but they were all, based off of other books that had been written. I could never find that corroborative detail to tell me, like. So
it starts getting a little far out on the tree. Yeah.
Exactly. So you're taking a lot of faith in the work that other historians have done, and some of those historians, I'd been reading enough and on topics, and I'd done enough research into these topics to know that some of what they had written was completely wrong. So I knew that I had to get as many primary sources for that mission as possible if I was going to risk my credibility telling that story. Couldn't find like I said, couldn't find anything. And then I had this idea. Martin Watson was a ranger from World War II. He'd been at Cisterna. He'd been captured at Cisterna, sent to a POW camp, and then he'd come back from that experience and gotten out of the Army. He'd had some run-ins with the law, and then he had rejoined the Army and gone back into the Rangers for Korea. He had led the mission, and I know that he had been taken captive. So I thought, well, maybe they'll have something. Maybe the National Archives will have something on his POW time. So I'd seen other sort of POW records in the course of my research. Usually those documents were around 2 or 3 pages. And so I asked the National Archive if they had, a POW record for Martin Watson. They said, yes, we do. But no one's ever seen it. It's never been declassified. So you would have to FOIA it. They're like, yeah, FOIA is a kind of a painful process. So,
yeah.
But I was like, oh, why not? I'll just, I'll FOIA it, and, in a few months it'll, show up. And that's what I did. When, I went back to Chicago, I wasn't, near the National Archives at that point, but I got an email from them, and they said, hey, we found, Martin Watson's POW record. It's available next time you're here. And I said, well, can you just send me the record? They said, no, we can't. It's in another, it's in a large box with other records, so we can't send it to you. It's like, well, how big's the box? And he says, about 750, documents in there. Wow. He's like, all right, well, I'll just get them. I'll get the papers next time I'm there. So one of my next research trips, I go out. I'd almost forgotten about it, but towards the end of the day, I was like, oh shoot, I've got that, those Martin Watson pages that I want to, take a look at. And at this point, I'd already abandoned the Virginia 1 mission. I knew that I wasn't going to have the material to write on it, but just out of curiosity, I decided to take a look. So they bring the box out, and I'm looking for the 2 pages, that are, related to Martin Watson and his POW captivity. And I quickly realized that all 750 pages are the Virginia 1 mission. They're Martin Watson's captivity. It's everything about the mission. It wrote the chapter for me.
That's such a crazy part of it, though, is you go in looking for just 2 pages. Now you have an entire other book to read. So I could see
Yeah.
how it went from 2 years to 8 years all of a sudden.
I should say though that those 2 years to 8 years, that I was never not thrilled about what I was doing. Like, it was every time I turned a rock over and found one of these things, it was never like, oh gosh, now I have to read another book. It was like, oh my God, I get to read another book.
Yeah, it's pretty fascinating stuff. Can I ask, how'd that discussion go with the publisher though? Like, so did they ask you for an initial timeline, and then as you're going along, you're like, you have to keep extending, or is it just like, I'm going to need this much more time, a lot more?
Yeah.
And then they're okay with it, or?
Well, in the beginning, my editor, who was a great editor, her name was Tracy Devine. She was checking up on me, and my agent was likewise. My agent was Jim Hornfisher. Excuse me. He was a an incredible historian in his own right. He'd written, I've got a shelf full of his books. Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors, Neptune's Inferno, a whole bunch of other things. But he had gotten me linked up with Random House and Tracy Devine, who was his editor. And so they were kind of like tag teaming, checking up on me in the first few months of writing. But at some point, Tracy was let go by Random House for reason. I don't really know what happened, but no one from Random House ever followed up with me about it. And then Jim got terribly sick. So they just completely forgot about me. So from the first year to the 8th year, I never heard anything from Random House.
Wow.
No one once sent me an email. No one asked my progress. No one. I just kept working. But I will say, I lived in constant fear that someone would eventually call and come to claim the advance.
Well, it must have been a nice surprise for them at the end of the writing, and someone just walks in with a completed book for them. They're like, "Oh, thanks for that."
I don't think it was. They first of all, when I contacted them, Jim was in the final few months of his life at that point. Unfortunately, he'd gotten a glioblastoma and was he was preoccupied trying to finish his own last book, and didn't have a ton of time to handle client type stuff. So I reached out, or I think he reached out to them and said, "Hey, Ben is done with his book," and they said, "Who?" And they had to contract, because I didn't have an editor at that point. They had to contract an editor for me, who just did. He wasn't a full-time employee, and he was. If it wasn't for his first read, I think they would have voided the contract. But I will say that when I presented the book to them, they were like, "Well, this isn't what the contract said." I was like, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, we contracted you for, a 100,000 word book. This is 250,000 words." So,
what are you complaining about? You got extra.
Yeah, right. I was like, "Well, I'd be happy to renegotiate and turn this into a volume 1 and 2, but they didn't." Yeah, it was the publishing side is always difficult, or it's difficult. I don't think authors, historians are super well equipped to deal with the
business side. Yeah, one of the things too, there's so much in this book, but out of all the research you did over all this time, how much of it that you read or reviewed, how much do you think, if you had to quantify it, did you end up leaving out? Because there's so many missions and so many things, but of all the effort you put into it, how much would you say you ended up leaving out of that?
Well, I tried to leave as much on the field as possible. The impulse, from every editor, in all time, is to cut as much as they can. They want smaller books, and publishing has changed even since even since By Water came out in 2021, the impulse is to write smaller and smaller books. When we hadn't quite hit that, phase yet in the publishing industry. They were still willing to publish big books, but there was definitely a reluctance. I had, numerous requests from the publisher. Like they were like, well, can you just take all the Army and Marine Corps chapters out? And I was like, absolutely not. Those are all, there's a reason all those chapters are in there.
That'd be hard to do.
Yeah, you can't talk about, how important it was for the SEALs to be the most concentrated group of Ranger School graduates, and how important that is. If you don't understand, what or where Ranger School came from, and how much had gone into creating that thing.
Yeah, exactly.
So you can't separate this thing. This is its own book. These aren't just Reader's Digest chapters that I stitched together. But they wanted to pull as much out as possible. Now, one thing that they did say that I ultimately agreed with, the first note I got from the publisher was, you need to get to the action quicker in each chapter. Not maybe it wasn't the action; it was you need to get to the point of the chapter faster. So I remember writing my chapter 2 on the Scouts and Raiders, and that the whole point of that chapter was to describe how important it was for troops to get on the right beaches, particularly on beaches that that could be landed on which the sand was dense enough to land on, and upon which there were beach exits for tracked and wheeled vehicles to get off the beach.
Yeah.
And I thought the best way to try and show that problem was by covering the Canadian experience at Dieppe. I don't know how much you know about being a Canadian, how much you know about the Battle of Dieppe, but it was a complete disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Some 5,000 Canadians are sent ashore. At least 1,000 of them are killed, and I think 2,000 are captured. It's one of the worst disasters in the early years of World War II. But I thought it set me up, for a great subsequent chapter. Publisher disagreed. The publisher thought, why don't you just say, how important Dieppe was, and then, move on to the, the point of the chapter.
Just a simple sentence. This is important. Move on.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I, in my head, like they say, for most authors, the phrase, that they talk about with, for novelists is, those sentences, those that you've fallen in love with, they call it killing your darlings, but it's for historians or history writers, they fall in love with their research, and they want to, present as much of the stuff that they found. And I'd found some great stuff on Dieppe. But ultimately they were right. After, I did what, any writer does. After they've talked to their editor, they get drunk and they MF them, and they they don't know what they're talking about. What have they ever done, or what have they ever written or read? But then, in the days after, and you're going through the 5 stages of grief, you realize that they're right. And you do need to get to the point faster, and you are, wasting your reader's time. You're being disrespectful of your reader's time if you don't, offer that courtesy. So that's what I did. I probably I left at least 50,000 words on the cutting room floor because of that.
So is there a possibility there is a volume 2 or a part 2 in some way?
No.
Or is it kind of it's all?
I think no. I wouldn't. I don't think I would do that. I have thought at some point, maybe if I ever created a Substack or some sort of blog or something like that, I would consider pulling some of that back. But some of that is just, I'm not thrilled with how it would, sit sort of, on its own.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of the stuff was, well written, and I really liked it, and some of the research was great. So what I did was, every time I was forced to, cut something like that out, I tried as best as I could to take all of those pages and just compress into the tightest possible, and saving as much as you can, especially some of the characters. Like I had to drop characters that I thought were fascinating. Pete Ellis is one of my favorite characters in the whole book, and I had to completely erase him.
Oh, wow. Well, yeah, and you know what? We'll definitely be getting into some of the characters too. I do want to, for listeners, there is Canadian history in this book too. Actually, one of the parts that you mentioned, because I wrote it down here. So the green beret itself, like the accessory, the clothing accessory. Clearly, I don't know anything about clothing or fashion, but the green beret itself, it was shipped from was it Dorothy Knitting Mills in Canada.
You're right.
Which is kind of fascinating. I didn't know that. That's where they came from at first. And then the color was called Dorothy's Green Rifle.
Yeah.
Rifle Green, sorry. Yeah, like there's little kind of bits thrown in there throughout. And that was one of the most fascinating pieces as I was going through. I'm like, wow, I'm learning more about this than, from my history classes here in Canada. So I thought it was really good. I do, you know what? And I think maybe it's a good time to just kind of transition into some of those characters and some of the writing that you were doing. Starting very kind of more big in scope, though, it seemed like I don't know if it's the way all these characters were, minus a few exceptions, but a lot of them seem to have like very big personalities. And then when you give the physical descriptors of a lot of them, some of them are pretty funny, but they're always like, there's like these hulking people and they've got like over exaggerated features. And I'm just wondering, is when you were writing about these people, when you're researching them, is that kind of the theme you got from what you were reading about all of these people, all their missions? It's like, you have to be that type of character. You're kind of like a bit over the top, maybe a little in your face. Like they just have such big personalities. There's no meek, mild guy who decides to storm a beach and he takes out all the bad guys kind of thing. You almost have to have a certain character.
I don't know that every character has the same traits, and I don't know that every character has the same, sort of in your face quality or is an over the top, larger than life guy. I did, I think when I was describing, Pete Peterson in the final chapters of the book. Pete Peterson is the SEAL platoon commander of 7th platoon. And compare Pete to like somebody like Dick Marcinko, who is the loudmouth, larger than life character that he was. I don't write about him, but somebody like Marcinko is great because he's such a, he jumps off the page at you. He's like a Charlie Beckwith or something like that. I mean, these are, you can fill pages of descriptions about these guys. Somebody like Pete Peterson, though, is a little harder to describe. He gives you less, but in that less, you find stuff in the quietness. I do think it's important when you're writing. Books can do things that the documentaries can't do. Movies can do things that documentaries and books can't do. But one thing books can do better than both documentaries and movies is they can physically describe somebody. They can and when you physically describe someone in a book, one, you're giving your reader something to kind of latch onto, but you're describing a person. Like, how many times do you read a history book where they mention a character and you have no idea what they look like? You don't know if they're short, tall, how they measure up to other people. You don't know if they're attractive, if they're unattractive, and those are just important things, and they're not just that, but I think we don't read books to like they're manuals. We read books because we want to know how people navigated situations before, and we want to find, traits that some of those people had that are similar to traits in us. Like you can identify with a character, and I just, they're.
Did a lot of that though surprise you from, you spent several years in the SEALs, so you're around those type of people or that community. Would it be the same as the community you experienced in the 2000s? Everything you're talking about back then, it's a whole cast of characters. It's a range of people.
It's a cast of characters, and it's a range of people. They generally, I noticed when I was in the SEAL teams that the guys tended to fall into one of two camps. They tended to be a little more quiet, cerebral, self-effacing, and then on the other side they were the loudmouth type. And I've said this all the time. Both camps can make an effective frogman. They can make an effective ranger. They can make an effective Green Beret. And they you create teams out of both personality types. And I know I'm cutting corners with describing personality types. There's various degrees of all of these things, but they both serve a purpose, and I think when you talk to planners or senior officers, they all want the self-effacing, quiet, professional guy, like the name of your podcast. They want that guy. It's really hard to find that guy. I mean, I talked to guys at Dev Group. At one point, they were describing the type of officer that they wanted as a guy that can be in a firefight on one day and the next day, show up in DC and give a briefing to the House Armed Services Committee.
Yeah, that's rare.
That's almost impossible to find. That's one in every several green teams. You're going to find a guy that can do something like that. But that's the hope, and it falls so far short of the reality. You train these characters, or you train, people to do the impossible. You tell them that you've trained them to do the impossible, and then you tell them, don't think that you're that great, because there's other people that have, they're going to think they're pretty great.
Yeah.
If you can get through a lot of these things and do the sorts of missions that these people can do, they're going to walk around with a little bit of swagger.
Yeah, it's like, how do you instill the humility piece in there, or I guess you kind of recruit for that at the beginning, but how do you make sure they kind of keep it throughout?
And if you can figure that out, I know that there's a lot of people who'd like to they'd like to hear from you. It's just it's an impossible conundrum.
Yeah.
And that's where leadership comes in. You got to, how do you keep these Mustangs that you've been training and racing? How do you keep them in line?
One of the things, and even especially speaking on leadership, I wrote like a little bit out here where it seemed like every time somebody had a great idea or there was a need that was identified, it led to just kind of a misabuse of a unit, and then they would get used for the wrong missions. Things would go bad, and then blame was doled out. Things were kind of blown up. So I had there was a need identified, then a unit would be created. Someone came up with the idea. They'd prove their value. They would succeed, but then they start to get misused. And you talk a little bit about that. After getting misused, they get disbanded. But there was a part in the book where you talk about the lack of clear mission statements. And then there is a bit of that ego among the leadership. I'm just wondering, do you think there was always, did all that have to happen before they could create the SEALs? Did all those, there's a lot of death in there, but could they have gotten to the SEALs faster? Was it just the right time and the stars aligning among leadership and all these bad things happening in the past? How hard would it have been to kind of skip some of the trauma and the bad stuff?
Good question. I don't know that you could have gotten there. I mean, the one myth that I was trying to disabuse everyone of was that and it was the myth that I believed. I mean, I understood that the SEALs had, come from the UDTs, and the UDTs had been used in World War II, and the UDTs and the Korean War had identified an opportunity to go beyond the surf and sneak ashore and blow up trains.
That was my limit of knowledge too. I thought it was UDTs and then SEALs. I didn't know it had all these other, army involved and everyone else.
And I just thought like it had been the SEALs or the operators themselves that had sort of pushed the boundaries of all this stuff. And it wasn't until I realized that it wasn't until I got into my research in the Korean War and I found numerous document after document describing how the UDTs didn't want to go ashore. Several of the UDT officers, they were pushing back from the Navy. The Navy was the one that wanted them to go ashore and blow up these trains. Mm-hmm. It wasn't the UDTs that had thought of it. Oh. So it was, I think a lot of this history had to sort of happen. I think we wouldn't have the structures that we have today had it not happened. I mean, we have built-in competition between branches of service, and for the most part that's a good thing. We encourage that at the various service academies. It's go Navy beat Army, or beat go Army beat Navy. Very healthy rivalries, and we want those rivalries to continue. But what became sort of toxic was when these units were created. Take for instance the Rangers. Rangers, a need is identified, like you said. We want to, for instance, in Korea, we don't have enough troops. We're getting pushed back into the Pusan perimeter. We want to, attack the enemy's rear supply lines. The best possible unit for such a mission would be the Army Rangers. So they create the Army Rangers. They send the Army Rangers to do behind the lines missions. Some of those missions go very, very well. So planners decide, well, if that mission went well, let's increase our bets. We'll just keep raising the odds and keep seeing if they can pull off the same sort of disproportionately strategic achievement. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. For the most part, they would continue to send them on, longer and longer shot type missions. And then they would, when the mission, like at Cisterna, fails, they end up blaming the unit for its failure. And I think that just came from, a misunderstanding in all ranks of the military of what made a special operation. You can't, it's not just an infantry mission that's behind the lines. You're using some sort of concealing medium, to get behind the enemy's lines, whether it's water or nighttime or something like that. And if you're going to use some sort of concealing medium like water, like night or something like that, you're going to have to use a smaller force, because it's really, really difficult to use a very large force in a concealing medium. If you're going to, send troops, behind the lines at night, it's difficult to keep everybody together, to keep everybody quiet, to keep them moving. So those troops have to be very, very well trained. But because they're small, they're also vulnerable. So the only kinds of targets they can attack, they have to be vulnerable too. And if you sort of upset the balance anywhere in that process, you're going to, it's going to lead to disaster. So if you, send a small unit against a hardened target, it's going to fail. If you send a large unit into a concealing medium, like darkness, and they can't move quietly, or they can't get ashore through a surf zone or something like that, they're going to fail. It's going to be some sort of disaster.
Yeah, I always found they had to match the men to the mission, or the team to the mission. It's not just guys with guns go out and do guy with guns stuff,
And there was just this confusion, among the higher ranks. Even the folks that had created these units, they didn't understand, what they were doing. And I think, we're at a weird place in our history right now where we've corporatized, special operations. We have, when I say corporatized, I mean we've created an entire corporation. No one else in history in the world has created a SOCOM, a Special Operations Command, which we have in Tampa, which is the parent command for all American special operations. No one else has a similar, structure in their military. The British don't, the Israelis don't. I mean, we've done something that no one else has ever done. We have we've made special operations big business.
Yeah.
But so what I get, I'll speak to units now, and I'll ask, what's a special operation? How do you define a special operation? How do you distinguish, what is special from what is conventional? Can special troops do unconventional missions? Or excuse me, can special troops do conventional missions, and can conventional troops do special missions? What's the difference? And I don't mean to put anyone on the spot when I ask the question. I just think it's a good mental exercise to go through. Like when you get, if a commander, assigns you, something, he wants you to do some sort of mission, before you, apply or come up with force lists and a con-op or a concept of operations, you need to think through, the whole mission. What are you doing, and why are you doing it?
Yeah. I would say, and I'm going to come to you, John, there, because I think you got something, but real quick, Ben, like the last 5 minutes of what you've been saying, I hope you talk to law enforcement, because this all applies to law enforcement. I couldn't tell you how many times superiors have come to us, especially when I worked in the gang unit, and it was like, hey, you're going to go out and you're going to intercept these guys that are coming into town to do a hit. Okay, but I have no special training in that. You remember that course we asked for vehicle interdiction or how to do these other tactics? You said no to. So I'm just a patrol guy wearing a different uniform. But then that comes into the conversation of, well, what makes you a specialized unit? Because they'll call you that some days when they want certain things. Then other days, no, you can't do these things, or we're not giving you that training. So it's like, what are we, and whose whim are we kind of going with? John, you had something there?
Yeah. But to your point, Nathan, one of the things that I've noticed in especially in the history of the Army, back in the late 70s, Special Forces was running this school called Special Operations Training, or SOT, and it was at this place called Mott Lake Compound. And it's kind of funny because back in the day, whenever you said SOT or MLC, your voice had to drop down an octave. And the thing is, it was like kicking in doors and clearing rooms. And there was this it was the spec ops thing of SF and Rangers and SEALs are, they got this high speed mission of kicking in doors, clearing rooms, and doing CQB. Well, the thing is, it's like you fast forward to Iraq and Afghanistan, and now it's Joe in the 1st Infantry Division who's kicking in doors and doing CQB and clearing rooms.
Mm-hmm.
So once it, to Ben's point, it's like you always ask, okay, what is the special in special operations? I was particularly struck by the point that the UDTs were pushing back against the Navy, telling them to go further onto shore. One that he'll appreciate is when you look at the history of the Marine Raiders. When the Marine Raiders in World War II were first proposed, basically the entire chain of command of the Marine Corps was totally opposed to the idea. Couldn't have hated the idea more. And one of the things that I wanted to ask Ben to speak on was basically the political influence for a lot of these units. And the Marine Raiders are it's a perfect example of introducing politics into it, and then also asking the question, well, what makes these special? Because for me, with fairly recent events, I always thought it was funny that Marine Special Operations Command eventually adopted the name of Marine Raiders. And I and a couple of my buddies were laughing about it because it's like they had adopted the name of a unit that the Marine Corps hated. And as soon as the opportunity came up, they disbanded it. And
I laughed too, John.
just some real quick background. It was an influence of the British Commandos, and it was basically coming from the President of the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, through his friendship with Churchill, and basically 2 Raider battalions were stood up, and the first battalion was commanded by a very conventional Marine named Merritt Edson. And his was basically, it was an elite infantry battalion. And the second Raider battalion was commanded by Evans Carlson, who, for all intents and purposes, was basically a communist. His background was, his background was, prior to World War II, he'd been a military observer with Mao's guerrilla forces and had actually participated in a Long March. And I laugh nowadays whenever I hear somebody use the term gung ho, because that actually came into the Marine Corps through Evans Carlson. That was the motto of the Chinese communist guerrillas, to work in harmony. And Evans Carlson brought that to the Marine Corps. And Carlson's Raiders, that was supposed to be behind the lines guerrilla force. And basically, he would have what the British call a Chinese parliament prior to an operation, where it's like, okay, guys, we've got this objective. We're going to get this island. What's your guys' input on doing this? Whereas with Edson's Raiders, it was just strictly, okay, yeah, we're highly trained Marines, and we're just going to kill people and break things the way that regular Marines do. And I once sent after his book came out, I sent a copy of the Marine Raider school syllabus to Ben, because the thing is, it's like, it was an 8-week school for Raider replacements, and you could tell it was written by Evans Carlson, because it was like 8 weeks of training to be a guerrilla fighter. And so the thing is, and then with the politics of the thing, the way that, the Marines were like, okay, we got to get rid of these Raider battalions. One of the first things that they did, the executive officer, or basically second in command of Carlson's Raiders, was Jimmy Roosevelt, who was a Marine officer who was the son of FDR. So they weren't able to disband them until he was no longer the son of the sitting president of the United States.
Yeah, no notes. Yeah, I mean, there has been, a number of folks that have put, a foot on the scale over the years to try and influence these various units. John's absolutely right. The Raiders themselves likely would not have been created if it hadn't been for Roosevelt. The Army Special Forces likely would not have had the influence that they had in the early years of Vietnam if it hadn't been for John F. Kennedy. It's a little bit of a misnomer or a misapprehension to believe that Kennedy is responsible for creating the SEAL teams. He didn't. The Navy had, before he was even inaugurated, the Navy had already been kicking around the idea of coming up with a group like what the SEAL teams ultimately became. But he definitely put his foot on the gas when it came to all of these various units. And once he...
That's in the book. Yeah, you mentioned this in the book with Kennedy.
Absolutely. And when planners are able to see sort of the writing on the wall before Kennedy even gets in there, and they know that he is predisposed to this kind of conflict, this kind of war, and so they are rapidly coming up with ideas on how they're going to field anti-guerrilla type units. So there's definitely, politics involved. And I think there's politics still involved in special operations. It's one of the favorite, entities that politicians have at their disposal: air power and special operations. The idea that you can get big strategic payoffs with small investment. It's who wouldn't, what politician or what planner wouldn't be attracted to that kind of promise?
You know what? I think that's really good. And again, I think a lot of the stuff that people could take from the book, it's applicable to law enforcement. Like when you're talking leadership lessons, you see like we've talked about, the cast of characters and just, what to really pick from some of these individuals. Just as we're kind of coming up to the end of the time, I did want to ask you, like, who is your favorite person that you wrote about or maybe even read about? Because you said you had to leave some people out, but in totality, did you have one that kind of stood out to you and you're like, I don't know, maybe if you're like, even if I went back to my time in the SEALs, I would maybe want to emulate them more so or change some of my game. But is there a particular person that stood out to you, and maybe what would you want to emulate about them?
There were definitely people that I didn't care for. You kind of have to, and I try
Okay.
I try not to let the reader know. You're always trying to be respectful when you write about some of these guys, especially like some of these folks have, like you mentioned Evans Carlson. Evans Carlson likely was, if nothing, he was very, very left leaning, and very peculiar. And his handling of the Marines on Macon was, it wasn't good. And so there's a lot to sort of look down on Evans Carlson. He's been lauded by a lot, but I think a lot of that's misappropriated. But it's not my place, I don't think, to be disrespectful of even Evans Carlson. I mean, Evans Carlson, look at how much a guy like Evans Carlson did for this country. Even when he was removed from command, and even when he knew that he had no future in the Marine Corps' leadership, he refused to leave the theater. He stayed in the theater. He continued to risk his life, and anyone who ever served with him, saw that this is a guy who's willing to, hang it all out there, for his fellow Marines. So, I mean, how can you not, respect a guy like that? And who am I, a guy who, did barely 7 years in the SEAL teams? Who am I to, criticize, somebody like that? But it's your job as, sort of the historian, sort of the reviewer, to make these judgments and to present them in as fair a way as possible, but also to, show some of their hangups or some of their faults, and show how, more importantly, how those, faults, ultimately led to, consequential moments. Without, Carlson failing at Macon Island, there's, the Marine Corps Raiders would likely still exist, or they likely would have at least existed until the end of the war. But because of his failure, because of his, inability to lead on Macon, it disabused the Navy planners of the potential of a force like that. Now, as far as favorite characters, there's a number of characters I sort of just, I read so much about them. I read their letters so much that they became like almost friends. And you can't help but, feel a sort of connection to them. Buck Halpern is one. Draper Kaufman is another. Pete Peterson. I've gotten to know Pete Peterson. One of the best moments for me after the book came out was they were doing a swim out at the SEAL muster. A swim out is when they every year they'll do a swim out for the SEALs who have passed away. So who those who have chosen to be cremated, many of them will choose to be released by their teammates into the ocean at Fort Pierce every year. And the year that I went down there to speak, Pete was going to be swimming out Bob Gallagher, who was another big character from the book. Now, I'd never gotten to interview Bob Gallagher. He was alive when I wrote the chapter, and I'd read, everything that was I could possibly read about him, and I'd interviewed everyone in his life that I could. And so I didn't need to interview him to write that chapter. I wanted to, but I just never got a chance. I spoke to him once on the phone, and he hung up on me. Honestly, though, like if he hadn't hung up, he wasn't rude about hanging up on me. But if he hadn't hung up on me, I would have been disappointed, because it was so much of what I understood of who he was, that he was never going to, self-promote. He just never was going to talk about.
Was it more just he wasn't interested in the book, like a book being written about him or a chapter?
I think that's what it was. I think he was so he was just both he and Pete, they were completely focused on their men, and they didn't want to take disproportionate credit for themselves, even though they, I believe both Pete and Bob working together changed the SEAL teams more than any admiral ever did. They were the ones that came up with the sort of repetitive capture kill cycle. They were the guys that went out, they ransacked intelligence from whatever means they could. They identified individual targets that they wanted to go after, and they went for those targets. They found those targets, they brought them back, they didn't kill them, they ransacked them for intel, and then they just kept that cycle going. And it's the cycle that ultimately we reappropriated in Iraq and Afghanistan. So when I got to know Pete through the writing of the book, and when it came time to go down to Fort Pierce to do the swim out, you have a muster at like 4:30 in the morning before the swim out happens, and Pete, who was in his 80s at the time, he they're going around the group there, and they're naming all the SEALs who are going to be swum out, and say, all right, Bob Gallagher, who's swimming them out? And, Pete raises his hand, you go out as swim pairs, and they're like, okay, who's going to swim with Pete? I shot my hand up so fast, just so I could be one of the guys that got to swim Bob out with Pete. And it was a moment. I have to say, it was it was one of the greatest moments from the writing of the book. And we get out there, and you get your fins on and everything like that, and they do an incredible sunrise ceremony with all the families out there and everything like that. And Pete and I are standing there holding the haversack with Bob's ashes in it, and the band stops playing, the drums stop rolling, and now all the swimmers are backing into the surf. And like I said, Pete is in his mid-80s at this point, and we're backing into the surf, and the rest of the swimmers are getting further and further away from us as we're going out. And I'm looking at Pete, and I like, are you going to be able to do that? Like, are you okay? Like, getting through the surf. I'm happy. You just tell me, Pete, I'll do whatever you want. We can either go back, or I can take, Bob out by myself. And Pete's just looking at the surf.
How far out do you have to go?
Like 200 yards, maybe 100 yards. Not terribly far. But Pete looks at me and he goes, I think there's only one thing to do here. And I'm like, all right, I know what that means. And I start to, take hold of the haversack to, start heading back in. Before I know it, Pete dives into a wave and he's gone. He takes off, and I'm doing my best just to keep up with Pete.
Wow.
As we're swimming out. But we got out there. We got out with the rest of the guys, and we let Bob go. It was pretty cool.
That's an amazing story. Well, I'm glad you got to experience that. And you know what? I think that it's almost a good conclusion for the whole process that you've been through. Certainly sounds like a good conclusion for Pete and the rest of the guys. And John, did you have something there?
Oh,
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I can't think of a better way to stick a pin in this one.
Yeah. Just as we're at the end of our time, Ben, I do want to say I really do appreciate it. What is next for you?
So I'm working. So since Bywater came out, I've been researching. I kind of pursued two or three ideas, and just to kind of see which one would which would go. I wrote a book that I've been told by numerous publishers that is unpublishable because it has to do with some politically sensitive type stuff at the time. The event that I'm writing about happened, more than 50 years ago, but there's some of the folks that I'm writing about in that book are still alive, and they're still, and I don't think a publisher really wants to take a risk on it at the moment.
Okay.
But I've been working on another thing at the same time, and I'm just kind of, my publishing kind of changed, out from under me. I got the contract for Bywater back in 2013. So this is 13 years later. I'm trying to, still figure out how this industry works. And like I said, I've done probably 3.5 years of research on this book that I'm working on now, and I've started writing. I'm really excited about it, but it's going to take another couple years before it gets out. It's just
as you were saying earlier, just about how publishing has changed. As podcasts have changed, and I think people are kind of coming around to the long format again, and maybe that'll help with the books, like in the length of the books. Not, I understand if it's a sensitive topic, people don't want a lawsuit or something, but there's even formats through. You can do a series of podcasts, and so there's different formats now. So there's a lot of different options, and I get, like you're saying, books can tell it a certain way that podcast can't, that a documentary can't, but maybe one comes before the other in this case. But it sounds very interesting. I'm intrigued.
I'm head over heels for the topic. I think it's fascinating. I think there'll be readers for it. I just I want to write books like Bywater. I want to write kind of long form, like you said. And the push right now in nonfiction is to write shorter and shorter, sort of books, and they want they want nonfiction to sort of read like it is fiction. Yeah. And that's great. There's a place for that. And I've read, a number of books, I think, but for somebody I'm trying to get the story right. I'm not, and there's a place for imagination in the writing of nonfiction, and there's a place for the tools that a novelist uses to tell a nonfiction or a true story. Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. I think publishers, though, are really hungry for a specific kind of book, or I think people are writing a certain kind of book that publishers are, trying to find authors that are willing to do that. Mm-hmm. I think some authors are taking they're getting out on a limb a little bit, and they're taking some not shortcuts, but they're taking a little bit of license and some of the stuff that they're doing. I'm not willing to do that.
Oh.
I don't want to tell a small story. I want to tell a big story. I want to ask a big question, and I want to have lots of elbow room to tell that story. So,
well, I can say, and I'll speak for John too. Maybe say we appreciate your efforts and we appreciate the work you do. The very last question: where can people follow you? So, where do you want them to best, reach out, contact if they want to speak?
Thank you. The best way to get in touch with me is on Instagram, probably, just like John did. That's really the only platform that I have any time for. I think LinkedIn is LinkedIn. I'm on there maybe once a week.
Yeah.
But Instagram, I'm talking to my kids on Instagram. Like that's probably the best way. So
when they're not out running around the neighborhood,
I'm surprised they didn't break in here. Talking. When I started the last book, they were babies, and now they're monsters. Incredible. So,
well, we're just at the end of the time. I want to say thank you very much for doing this and for all the service, right? Like through the SEALs, everything that comes with that, and then you continue to serve in writing. And
you as well. You guys as well. Thanks so much. It was a delight to talk to you. John, thanks for connecting everybody together, and Nate, wonderful to meet you, and you be safe.
Yeah, I'll try.
Thanks.
Hey everyone. Thanks for listening in and following along with the discussions. Be sure to click the follow or subscribe button on your respective listening platform. Also, check out the Quiet Professional on X and Instagram under TQP780. And most importantly, please share where you can. Everyone has a part to play in getting these education and information pieces out there, so pass it along. Thanks again.